Hey guys, how's it going? This is Derek Craig with another oilfieldbasics.com Discover podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is the podcast where we learn something new about our incredible industry on every single episode. I'm going to keep my introduction short again, as is becoming typical now with all these podcast stuff that we're doing. We've got the interns rolling. They're doing great. They're producing some great content, working up some great collaborations with a handful of other companies and individuals on a variety of their topics. And I'm sure you've heard from them already at this point on the podcast. If you're a faithful listener, be sure to always be checking our oilfieldbasics.com website and also our LinkedIn page, following us for what release dates, new courses and stuff that we're releasing, and also live events that we're doing. So lots of things are happening right now. As I just wanted to, to make sure you guys are on the watch for these things. Today we're going to be talking about basically kind of diving into the world of public data. Definitely a lot within this space, and we haven't really had anybody kind of come on and discuss, what's happening in the space, just to kind of orient the rest of us to what things happen to data providers and stuff that are out there and exist. And so we're going to be talking with John Ferrell from WellDatabase. So I'll pull him on here in just a minute. But again, thanks everybody for listening. Please be sure to drop a review on this podcast in your favorite podcasting app, whatever you listen to us in. Please drop a review that helps others to find us. And of course, share it with a friend that helps others to know and to learn along with us all as well. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in and for listening. Like I said, today we're talking with John Ferrell. He's the co-founder and CEO at WellDatabase. So he's got a computer science degree from University of Texas at Austin. He's worked with a handful of different technology companies over the years. And then about 2009 kind of started forming WellDatabase nights and weekends kind of thing. And then grown it into what it is today. So I'm really excited to have him on and talk about this space. So John, thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. We did WellDatabase as a side gig before side gigs were cool. So hopefully it's a trend we see more and more of these days. That's cool to do.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with side gig space. Yeah, no, that's really cool history. And I've talked with some people on your team and kind of got a little bit of a lowdown on the story of a little bit of your background, but in the creation of WellDatabase. But I'd love for you to kind of go into a little bit more depth. Tell us your little journey. Since you went to school, and it sounds like your computer science, like I talked about. But how did you get into oil and gas? And I assume you went to UT, and there's oil and gas all over the place. But walk us through your journey here.
It's a funny one because, I went to school at UT in the late 90s. I was doing web development on the side as kind of a hobby. And then I got a job doing some of it as well. The people I was going to school with at UT, some of them have become pretty big names in Silicon Valley. And, the timing is right, coming through a computer science type program in the late 90s. And so it was great, except for the fact that it's the year 2000 comes and .com bust hits. And, here I am with doing computer science and Austin is shut down. There is nothing going on. And so through some connections and some people that I knew, I found out that Shell was looking for a web developer, which was kind of unique at the time, a company the size of Shell doing web applications in 2000. But so I jumped on it, moved, and I'm from Houston originally. So I moved back over to Houston and thought it would be an interesting gig to come work in the oil and gas industry. And then 20 years later, I'm still here. So it's something that grabs you, and it's an industry that, maybe today is not known for having great job security, but back then it was always jobs in the 90s, 2000s in oil and gas. And so it was a great industry when the rest of the tech industry was kind of falling apart at that time. We came over here, worked at Shell. I ended up going over to Schlumberger. I did some contract work. We're a contract firm. We did jobs with Halliburton. We did them with Schlumberger. We did them with Reed Hycalog. And then I joined New Tech Energy and helped build their IT group. And I was honestly probably employee number 20 something, early 20s. And we grew up over to 100 and 120 employees at one point in time. And so that was an interesting experience to come up with an oil field services company. They do log analysis, frac design, reservoir engineering kind of thing. So it was interesting to help build up a company there, build out data centers, applications, data management. And, through all of those jobs, I was able to touch just about every piece of data that comes through our industry. So not on purpose, but we got exposed to every type of data that now we deal with WellDatabase. So it was a great kind of priming to get into it. And so, get into oil and gas and, you start looking around at data and then cost, and you rewind back to 2008, 2009, and, states jumping on the bandwagon for making data available. And then yet some of the players in the market who provide data were prohibitively expensive. And so, honestly, just looking at what the costs were kind of was the first decision that, hey, we should try to do something about this and jump in and see if we can do a better job with data than some of our other providers. But yeah, definitely a sordid, kind of twisted way to get into oil and gas. But yeah, it's one of those things you learn the industry, and yeah, you appreciate what it is. And again, with a good number of people I went to school with are the Silicon Valley types now. It's just a different world here versus there, and I kind of prefer this one.
Yeah. Gotcha. No, definitely. I mean, that seems like how most people kind of come in the industry. A lot of times I get people on here and how they give their little quick talk about their background, and some of the stories just so crazy, but incredible. And and it's cool though that you guys can compare it to different other industries and whatnot, and have history, and bring in some of that insight from other industries into oil and gas too. So definitely pretty cool background there. But so I think as we kind of start down this, the story of WellDatabase and kind of how you guys differentiate yourself and everything, I think that'll kind of come out of that. So we'll hold that off for just a second.
Yeah.
I want to orient the listeners in terms of, you kind of talk, about, using data and stuff in Shell, but then there's also, a point to where a lot of this kind of started, I assume what primarily you could only get like what internal data kind of before. And then, like you said, a lot of states and like a lot of agencies kind of started where companies had to report, X data. And just give us a little bit of the lowdown in terms of what data publicly exists. Like when did that kind of take off, and what progression you've seen kind of historically, like get us to the point that we are right now and help us understand what is out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the late 90s, when web development became a little bit more interesting, and if you are old like me, there's the whole Web 2.0 movement that happened, which was kind of a great marketing ploy. But anyway, the idea was that interactive websites where people don't realize it, that before then you went to a website and it was like a static page and you just looked at it and that's all there was to it. There was content out there, you read it, there was no interaction with it. So to think of that, it seems pretty, it's like people viewed it as like a yellow pages on the internet. And so Web 2.0 was really more about the interaction, people being able to submit information, people being able to retrieve information, database, front end, back end kind of system. So anyway, late 90s, that comes around. Railroad Commission decides to put out some of their information about wells that they permit. And so they're kind of updated some of their systems, and they were able to kind of put some information out there. It was pretty ugly. And, they had the old mappings, the first web mapping systems. If you ever used MapQuest back in the 90s, it's that kind of, terrible architecture and really kind of, just dated information and how it was put in. But anyway, that's when it started. And Railroad Commission was kind of one of the first ones that came online with it. And then throughout the early 2000s, you saw Louisiana come on with Sonris, and then New Mexico came out with their system, and then it started to kind of spread from there, kind of driven by the most popular states at the time. And so like a state like North Dakota didn't do anything in the early 2000s. It wasn't until the Bakken really started to take hold that they came out, which was interesting because they gave them the advantage, because they got to step back and say, well, what did everybody else do? And then let's make a system that gives people what they want, which is why today the NDIC has one of the best systems out there. And it's not overly robust. It's not anything special, but it's simple. It has the data you need. It's consistent. It's updated. And so from our standpoint, it's one of the best sources out there. But, the Railroad Commission has more data. It's just in 75 different systems, and it's convoluted and messy. And so that's a good, the timeline happened like that, to where in 2008, 2009, every major producing state had some sort of online system. And if the state didn't have it, it was a university system that hosted it, or it was a tax commission, or even the federal government had stuff online. The EIA started doing things. Frac Focus started coming around shortly after that. And so there's been a progression. We've been a little flat over the last handful of years as far as new data being made available. The Railroad Commission biggest update that I can remember from a data perspective is they started making additional completion information available back in 2009, 10. But then what you're seeing now is a little bit more investment in visualizations and analysis. So Railroad Commission put out some, they've turned a lot of their data free on a bulk download basis. And then they've put out some BI dashboards that you can look at. And, why the Railroad Commission is putting out dashboards for analysis is kind of just their prerogative, I suppose. But other states aren't really doing that. And then you've got some states, North Dakota has interpreted tops now instead of just the reported tops. Pennsylvania has their Edwin system that has fully interpreted information and logs thrown in with the public information. So the uniqueness about the United States is that each state gets to completely regulate their own oil and gas data requirements and the filings and everything like that. So while, it's probably a positive in some ways, it's a very big negative when you're trying to compile this data set nationwide. It's still a challenge kind of meshing in all the sources together. And, but as far as the timeline, that's really what it was. And up till about, 2007, 2008, there were sources that just weren't online and you couldn't get the data. And so even the bigger players in the market, they had states that they didn't have data for because they just didn't make it available. And then other ones, states had choices whether they wanted to be involved in the API kind of classification, because there was a time where API numbers weren't assigned, if you can imagine. And so states had a choice with that. So anyway, it's been a slow and steady movement. But, from about 2010 on, we've had some really consistent delivery from the states.
Okay, gotcha. I guess kind of in terms of what most states, or what most, like, give us an idea of what data actually is out there too. Like, so what is most people reporting? Like, who's wanting it? Like just a little bit of the lowdown on that too.
Sure. So pretty universally, wells are permitted. So you file a permit before you can actually poke a hole in the ground. And so that's pretty common across every source. The amount of information required to drill your well is varied. Some of them require as, detailed as which formations you're hitting, at what depths you're planning, at what bottom and surface holes, which formations you're planning on penetrating. And other ones are just like, what's the date you plan on drilling? And so it's maybe not quite that broad, but still the detail in which but a permit is still a universal idea that the wells are permitted. The well drill, so a spud information and that stuff is actually pretty variable as if you ever get that information, at least when it happens. So we track rigs that go around, but that comes through Baker and other sources. And so not from the states, because most states won't require a filing when the spud happens. And so you have to typically wait until the completion happens to get the completion documents, which will detail the well construction, the directional surveys, the plats, any logging that was done, where the perfs were put, what the frac information and frac focus. Fortunately, people were able to jump on that bandwagon pretty quickly. Frac focus data is messy, but at least it's a single source where all of the frac data started going. And so the states saw that as an opportunity to allow them to deal with it. And they just said, go to frac focus. But that happens at the completion. So between when a well is permitted and when a well is completed, typically it's kind of crickets. So we try to supplement that utilizing, tracking the rigs and trying to identify where the rigs are, cross-referencing some information out there about completion crews. But then and even some players are dealing with satellite imagery to try to identify what's happening, but that's all because there's no real communication from the state between the permit and the completion. But once it's completed, then you get all the information about how it was drilled, how it was completed, the everything about the well. And then production obviously typically starts right away after that. And so the production data is then updated each month as the well goes on. And then, there's some interesting pieces on after that point. Once a well is producing, to shut in a well, to formally shut in a well, requires that you, in many states, that you run a test and that you file shut-in paperwork. But that means when you're going to be shut in for a minimum period of time. If you're shutting in wells for offset completions, typically no paperwork's required at all. You're doing a partial month shut in and no one cares. And then the same thing happens with workovers, with the recompletes, depending on, there's a fuzzy line as when you're working over a well, when you're actually recompleting a well, and when paperwork is being filed and when it's not. And in the States, we'll say if you're recompleting, you need to file a new completion document. But companies will kind of say this isn't a real recomplete, for whatever reason they want to. So sometimes you'll have that paperwork, sometimes you won't. But you can watch the production on a well, and you can try to identify those events during a well life. But monthly you'll get production for the well life, and then if it goes to plugged, then there are plugging reports that happen in some states. In other states, I just get a plug date, and that the well got plugged up, and that's it. So that's kind of the full scale of what you get in a well life. And to the side of that is leasing, and those documents and those things happen at a county level typically, and so county courthouses have all that information. That's kind of different because it's land-based versus the well-based, and so we actually kind of don't deal with the land-based today, because still probably the majority of counties don't have online systems that allow you to get that data in a way that you can database and search and deal with. And so many of the companies who provide it have to have feet on the ground at the counties. That's so much of our business is about automation and keeping our head count down. So it's not an issue we've tackled yet, but it is something that's on our radar, obviously.
Yeah, and that's something I've heard that more and more, like county courthouse, those records are starting to go more and more online. But the thing with that too, like if you are collecting it manually, that stuff can change so quickly and easily that you don't want to be liable for saying something's the way it, X when it's changed to Y already. So it needs to catch up to. And I think there are some players in that space that I've heard of kind of recently that are I think going to grab up that opportunity when it comes out. But I expect about all of these data companies, including yourselves, probably would too once that happens. But
and then the formats are the trickiest part, honestly. The ones that even come online, a lot of them are just unstructured data, and there's companies who've built their entire business around interpreting the unstructured data to try to pull out the relevant pieces of information, which is great. But for a company like WellDatabase, it's a big side. We'd have to charge an entire different product for it, which is okay. People, I think, expect that, but for the cost it would create to do that today, I think we'd rather say, well, maybe they'll start converting to a more digital format where we can take it in a little easier and provide it at a better cost. We'll see where that goes, but it's absolutely a little bit of a all over the place now. It's bad enough having every state having its own reporting for well information. If you turn to every county, you have thousands of counties reporting it. So now you've multiplied exponentially your sources. And that goes for everything from tax rolls to land, lease ownership and those things. And so, but there's a lot there. There's definitely a lot there outside of the well level. For sure.
Well, give us a little bit of a perspective too, in terms of what, especially if someone's not so much on the E&P side or the operated side, what are people doing with this data? Who's wanting it? And what do they do with it?
So that's great. I having a little bit more of a service company background for myself, and data service company, not necessarily tool service or anything like that. When we started WellDatabase, I think we kind of had that focus of from the service company standpoint. So, which is interesting because it turned out to be a little bit more of a broad focus. So service companies will use this data to identify potential clients. So if you're providing a service, you want to know who's permitting, who's actively drilling, who's completing. And so it helps you kind of have your acquisition, your targets, so that you can, who are the better sales targets for any particular opportunity. But then beyond that, essentially if you're providing a service, then ideally your service is providing value that translates to something, ideally in a lot of cases increased production, but not always. But regardless, using our data, you're able to come back after the fact and understand, the wells I worked at, were they more successful? Were they less successful? Did their completion plan follow what our guidelines were? Did they use this tool did they follow through with what we did? And then also, what was the net effect? Was it positive? Was it negative? And, things like, log analysis, you could say, were the zones that I, analyzed, they produce as they should now. So that was a much bigger thing in conventional reservoirs. Unconventional is a little bit different, but regardless, some of the same ideas still come into play. If you're a chemical company and you want to know if your chemical blend was successful versus offset wells, well, you can come into WellDatabase, look at the customers you worked for, compare it to the offset wells that didn't use your blend. And if yours is outperformed, then hand that to sales and say, you outperformed the competition. If it didn't, hand it to R&D and say, why aren't we doing better? So that's from a service company standpoint, from speccing, from R&D, and then also a way to bolster your offering is what I tell a lot of our service companies. If you're doing if you're providing a service, why not attach some offset data with it so that customers understand why they should use you versus somebody else? And then also it's a little bit of insight into the area, the basin that you're working in, especially, along the lines of your particular service. So that was a service company. And in doing that, it made it really broad because E&Ps like to do M&A deals. They like to look over the fence and what the other operators are doing. And so that's actually relatively a narrow scope compared to what service companies need to do, because service companies are all over the place and they need to have data everywhere, and they need to do comparisons on the fly and that kind of thing. But E&Ps will want to dive into an area and they'll want to understand the area better. So they'll want to jump in and say, who are the top operators here? How are they performing versus the other operators? What do their completion plans look like? What do my completion plans look like? What is the net difference between the two? Are they seeing increased production? Are we? So, I mean, the peeking over the fence thing has been a thing for a long time. And so being able to evaluate offset data is really key to understanding your data and your performance. And so E&Ps is a pretty fairly established workflow. But then beyond that, financial analysts, investment banks, PE firms, hedge funds, they're all gotten into using the data a little bit more, both to understand M&A activity. So, I mean, just visually inspecting, are these two players offset? Was this acreage actually offset of the acreage it was quoted in? Do these investor report claims add up to what the actual data says? And then, some forecasting. They can say, a particular operator's acquisition, if we can take the public data, forecast out the production data, understand what the forecasted revenues might look like. That's all finance related information. So those three distinct areas are where we find most of our customer bases. And that's kind of the workflows they use. And you could tack on mineral buyers in there, kind of in the E&P side more. They do a lot of the same workflows, but just maybe not as detailed. So yeah, it's a lot about understanding production, about forecasting production, about acreage and offset production, and who's doing what, and completion techniques. And so, but yeah, that's broad scale how everybody's using this kind of data.
Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you, throwing while we're along these lines here, is when we talked previously, you'd mentioned that a lot of people are primarily just doing kind of like analytics on them and not so much actual, you said AI, right? So can you kind of hit on that and kind of just explain what you mean by that?
So it's funny, AI has gotten kind of synonymous with it runs on a computer. And so I'm waiting for someone to call Microsoft Word an AI tool. But it's the fact of the matter is AI is a very real technology. It's about, rules engine and a learning capabilities to modify your rules. And so there's very, very real technology and very real applications. And by and large, people talking about in the oil field aren't talking about AI. They're talking about, a lot of times they're talking about just analytics. But, there are some practical applications to machine learning more than AI, because machine learning is good for identifying gaps in data to help interpreting relationships and help identifying kind of maybe missed relationships. Now, that comes with a lot of perils because, it doesn't necessarily take physics into account, which people have found, that the data they get doesn't make any sense, and that's because it doesn't. You have to train it right. So all of these things have to be trained, and if you train it blindly, you get blind answers, and if you train it properly with the right intentions, you get more correct answers. But the real power in it falls somewhere in between, where you train it with the right basics, but then you're open to new relationships that you didn't see. So what you get in the oil and gas industry is a lot of people who've either run machine learning models over either too small sets of data, and the answers just spit out what they expected, because of course, if you have 100 wells and you're running machine learning over it, it's going to tell you what you already know more than likely. It's whenever you include other people's data, if you include broader scales of data, broader sets of data, and work at a larger scale, then you'll start seeing insights that eclipse kind of your knowledge of your little piece of the basin or play.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important to note those, people looking at analytics, that's not machine learning, that's not AI, that's pure analytics. And that is one of the most powerful pieces of what you can do with the data, is where you can, analyze who are the top producers, look at their type curves, look at their production, look at their cum charts. That is enough to dive in. The idea to throw in machine learning and AI, I mean, there are some people that actually do it, most aren't. And so it's important to recognize at least that you don't have to go, deep and spend $1 million on an AI project that gives you answers that you already knew. There's, the analytics that you can get on products like ours give you the insights that you're really after.
Okay, gotcha. And so I think this is pretty much the perfect transition into telling us, about kind of the WellDatabase story, why you guys, kind of how and why you guys started, and what the difference focus is that you guys have than other data companies, and just some of those key differentiators.
Yeah, so it's funny because I like to tell people we're the first oil and gas software company that was actually started by software developers. Everybody knows this. Like, every piece of software you use was some engineer who was trying to fix a problem and learned how to code, and then he made the software, and that sounded really good. Is like, programmed by engineers for engineers kind of thing. But then it turns out that engineers, by and large, are terrible at UI design, at technology, at layouts and usability. And so you end up with these clunky software packages that do everything you need, but they're a nightmare to use. So anyway, we, three of us who were software developers who had worked in various jobs together, decided that, we looked at it, we looked at particular budgets. People are spending $500,000 on data. And we looked at all these sources have now become public. And so everybody's pulling the same public data, and yet somehow people are paying six figures for this data that's free out there. And so we said, well, why don't we just go get the data ourselves and sell it? And I've heard other people say that since, and it's much more complicated than that. So it was a little bit of a misjudgment on our side, but regardless, we kind of persevered through it. And so our goal always was to build automated systems to go get the data. And that was going to be the key differentiator number one, is that we have an automated system to go get it. We don't need a staff of 50, 100 people to get data. We're going to let the computers do it for us. And then we're not going to do it blindly either. We go and get the data, but we generated our own rules engine to help cleanse the data, to help normalize the data, to help make the data usable. If you get just raw data and drop it in a system, it is not usable, not at all. And so there are steps that are absolutely mandatory. And then there are additional steps that make it, actually good. And so our systems were built to be automated on all of those fronts. And so that's primarily what we did on those nights and weekends years without a product. We built back-end systems that went out and got this data, that cleansed it, and made it usable. And then we built a front end on it. And that was key. The front end part is interesting because the same thing, being software developers and, my background and the people I knew in Silicon Valley, we were very abreast of the latest technologies that were out there that obviously none of the other groups are using because their stuff was terrible. And so we rolled out our front end systems using the latest kind of web technologies, the latest kind of data and analytics tools. We had to build a lot of these things from the ground up because of the scale that we're working at. So in WellDatabase, we aggregate almost 600 million production records on the fly. So anytime you zoom, you move, you pan, you group, it can generate a type curve in a matter of a couple seconds for each of the operators in your search. And so it's in order to do that, we needed a little bit more performance than anything else that was out there. So we had to build some homegrown stuff, but then we also used open source. We used a lot of newer technologies, and what kind of came together is what you have today. So it was a focus on automation, a focus on newer technology, a focus on usability, all things that were completely lacking, especially at that time in the industry. And so that's why we started it. And so we built those systems, those automation systems, and they still run today. It's an iterative process. So as we find problems in the data, we don't just fix the data, we implement rules to fix the data. And as you can imagine, as time goes on, you implement new rules, and they're additive to each other. So your data just continues to get better and better and better. So you find a problem, you fix it, and you fix it for all past wells, and you fix it for all future wells. And then you go on to the next problem. So what has come to be over time is that process has allowed us to have a cleaner data set than a lot of other customers and a lot of our competitors, which is not something we set out to make a cleaner set. In our minds, the data was clean as it was going to get, but we found out that we could make it cleaner by doing that. And then, of course, by automating, we keep our headcount low, we keep our prices low, and we offer an ability to access the data and tools for a cost that's honestly half or less than what our competitors do.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm curious to learn more about, like you said, kind of like the cleaning and conditioning data that has to happen on it. Because it sounds like even your expectation, right? Whenever you start this, was that data is just data. It should be good to basically just pull and basically display, right? Just work on the user side of it. But give us an insight into what all stuff has to happen in the background to make the kind of user interface that people are familiar with. If they use WellDatabase and go on a site and do some decline curve analysis or whatever they're using it for, pulling production records, whatever. Give us some idea of what has to happen.
Yeah, it's actually pretty amazing how bad some of the data is. And starting at the highest level, I mean, there's wells that have locations that don't fit in the counties that they're assigned to. I mean, that kind of level of misapplied data is out there, and you have to clean it out. It's not super prevalent, but still, regardless, that level, I mean, we have a rule that says is well location in county. And so we have to test that. And if it's not, then we go through a series of steps to identify, well, where is this well actually at? Or, what's right? Is the location right, or is the county right? And then you start diving in, and you could figure it out using some auxiliary data. But regardless, that level of data is wrong in the public system in some cases. Those are a little bit more rare. But then as you move through, things like operators show up 70 different ways, especially when you go across all the producing states. They're no joke, thousands of variations of operator names in there that we have to roll up into one, because it's no use to you to see, WPX in 14 different ways. You kind of want to roll up WPX as a company, and that's it. So, I mean, that's something that's and that's
just by like all the subsidiaries, right? Or acquisitions, right, through the years. That's pretty much what that is. There's different names in each date or.
Well, yeah, that's a thing for sure. But that's actually the easier parts. The harder parts are when they put a comma or a period or a space or something like that, or they put production or prod or co or company, LLCs, and all these different auxiliary terms that really are indifferent, except for when they do matter, because Anadarko Minerals versus Anadarko is not necessarily the same thing. And so it's like they don't matter and then they do matter, and you have to be able to decipher, which variations do roll up and which ones don't. The company ones are a little bit easier, to see, WPX has a Mid-Con, a Permian, Rockies, and so it's WPX Rockies, WPX Mid-Con. So rolling those up to WPX Energy, pretty easy. Those are nice. But the hard ones are when they're a little more nuanced, and there's a production and a production company and a minerals, and you're like, are production and minerals the same company, or are they different companies? And so some of those require just manual intervention to say, is this the same or is it not? But that's a very, very widespread problem, but not that complicated to dig into. Once you kind of establish your sets of rules and things, you can get a good answer. A more widespread problem that is excessively complicated is allocating lease production to the wells. I say excessively complicated. It's only excessively complicated because there are a number of factors that go into it that can completely twist things, some of your base assumptions about wells. For example, when a well is completed, what if it had production on that well a month before the well was listed as completed? Offhand, when you're doing lease allocation, you're like, these wells come online when they're completed. But in some cases, you'll find out that production predates the completion date, not because it literally happened, but because there's a problem. There's you want to have these base assumptions. A well's completed and starts producing, and then you can start working on allocating the release level production to the well level. But then whenever those base assumptions are wrong, you have to go down to that level and say, where did this well really get completed? And then when did it come online? And of course, in a state like Texas, a well can get a completion record without being actually completed, because they file paperwork to be completed first. And then they come back through and they fill in the initial completion information second. But then they also, if you don't file all your paperwork, they'll list a well as shut in and say that the forms are lacking. The well's not really shut in. It's just the paperwork issue. In Texas, there's a pending lease report where the production goes in before it goes assigned to a lease. And then at a later date, that production will get rolled into the lease. But then the Railroad Commission doesn't always know when that happens. And so we have to come through and determine, does this look like this production got added to the lease or not? So we have to look at what the lease did historically, look and see what changed, does it add up to the pending lease data or not, and then determine, is that in addition to the lease volumes or is it a part of the lease volume? So those kind of things we have to do every month with Texas Railroad Commission data. And that's a very tricky problem. But at the end of the day, you need to have well level data if you want to try to do things like forecast production out, to understand your activity and which wells are outperforming other wells. I mean, it doesn't really do you a ton of value to say this lease is outperforming another lease, because there's so many variables in the lease. It's
like multiple wells on that lease, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and then there's other states that, and they started to change. There was a couple of states did quarterly production for a while, which was kind of comical. And so we, again, you want to create a type curve. We create a type curve off of quarterly production. And then you want to compare from one state to the other, where one's monthly and one's quarterly. And then you want to compare that to a lease level allocated one. So now you've got these apples and oranges and pears and grapefruits that you're trying to compare. And so our goal was to get apples across the board, which means that month level, we needed to turn that quarters into month, or some annuals into month. And then we needed to turn lease into well and get all in one place. So those kind of challenges are what you have to address to make the data even usable, really, in our opinion. And so, yeah, from everything from a well being misplaced to the, variety of naming especially for roll up purposes, you need to have consistent naming to roll all these values up, to the, the nuances of production allocation and things like that. Those are all kind of different levels of steps, but man, it's a lot of work has to go in to make this data useful.
Oh, definitely. And this is something that obviously makes what you guys do very valuable. And that's why company like we talked about, like the service companies and the EMPs and hedge fund managers, like everybody, wants, needs a source that has conglomerated all this, like you guys have, and is willing to pay for it, because to condition it, they're going to take way more man hours and have way more time and probably money in on it too. So definitely a very valuable service you guys, and it scales too, right? You can offer this to all the above. You can offer this to everybody. So let's another thing I'm curious to learn more about is kind of how you make the decision on what tools you build internally. So like people can use on like your user interface or on your websites, like we've mentioned, like the Clunker analysis, and like you can do and you can mention some of the other stuff you guys that people can do on your website. But how do you decide what tools you build on your website that people can use versus just let them have the data and they can build their own analysis tools? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh no, that's a great question, because our first pass was that exact thing. It was, we're going to be a database and we're going to allow people to hop in and get the data they need, because everybody wants to do something different. Everybody wants to take it a different way, of a different purpose, which is still true. But what we found is that people didn't like that. They didn't want They, even though many of them still take it out to other softwares, they still wanted some answers. They wanted to dive in and answer a question quickly. But then again, taking data out of our system is still one of the most popular things people do. So it doesn't mean that it's not done. But at the same time, the number of answers that we're providing is growing over time. So, to answer your question, what do we decide to do? There is a little bit of a mix. I mean, so what we kind of overall strategy is that we listen to our customers, we gain feedback from all our customers. And so we have over 12,000 users on our platform now. And so we get a lot of feedback every single day on what they want to see, which is great. The only problem with feedback is that you have to interpret it sometimes to find out what are you actually trying to accomplish. Because we don't want to just throw every feature that everyone throws our way, or else we're going to have a bunch of disjointed features and you're going to be like that engineering software that nobody likes anyway. But no, so what we do, we try to listen to our customers and say, well, what are we really trying to accomplish? And then we try to do it better than the other ways that are out there. And so it's a mix of listening to our customers, but then also trying to actually understand the problem. And that's where, you can get some real value, is because you understand what they're trying to accomplish. And then you give them a new way of doing it that happens faster and easier, and it's more dynamic and more flexible. And so like our decline curve analysis tool is probably a great example. So people wanted to drop a decline curve on there, right? Black and white, pretty easy idea. We can do a best fit and all those things. That's just math. But then from the interface, what we found out that customers struggle with trying to find out what fit works and what fit is best and when a fit is good or when there's a better fit or something like that. And so what we've done now is we have allowed people to add multiple fits to multiple types of curves. So, a P10, a P50, a P90 production curve, a daily, a monthly curve, and then you can create a regular best fit, decline, a hyperbolic, a modified hyperbolic, but you can create all of them at once, and you can get little summary cards about how well does it fit? What are the parameters that are used? What do the EURs look like? And so what we found is that people love to come in there now and create 5 or 6 different scenarios, look at each one of them, say, how different is this? Does it matter? And then they pick the one that they like and they move on. And so, that's the kind of idea that people told us, that they liked our best fit, but they wanted more granularity. They wanted to understand our best fit. They wanted to play with other fits. And so what they really wanted was what we came out with the multiple fit kind of idea, that you can run and then compare the fits to each other with hard numbers and make better decisions. And so, listening to our customers is the key driver. But then beyond listening, it's really understanding what they're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. And then, so any other big things that, people can do on your side you just want to mention in case people are wanting to find this stuff useful, that they might even want to
absolutely. No, there's stuff. So the basics, and we touched on some of those, like looking over the fence. On our system, you can, easier than any other system out there, you can go dive into an area, choose the color by the operator, and your map will change colors, and it'll change you to an analytic screen where you see a pie chart broken down by the operators in the area. You can see type curves. You can see rate versus cum curves. You can see, rate over time curves. You can see activity over time, and then broken, the total activity stacked, as well as the individual operator activity in between. So at one glance, you can hop in and see who's active, who's got the most production, who's got the best wells, whose activity, what they look like over time, and then even like histogram out IPs and relate those. But then taking it a step further, because the question will always be, such and such operator A has got the best wells. Well, why? Well, then you can pop over into our customized chart where you can start dropping on parameters. So you say, well, let's look at what operator A versus operator B is doing. So first we can compare their production over time. Well, now let's compare their lateral lengths and their proppant loading. Let's compare their chokes. Let's compare their, the perf lengths. Let's compare all of these different, completion items that go into it, to start analyzing, well, what's the difference between these two operators? Because if they were exactly the same, then maybe you go to geology is why they're best. But if they might have variances. And a great one is Anadarko in the southern Delaware Basin. they're choking back well. The strategy for choking wells has created a place where the other operators like EOG, they would rather not choke back their wells. They like to let them flow. And so it's a great analysis tool because at first glance, EOG, doubles up on Anadarko for their in their initial production in those fields. But then if you look at it closely and cum them, then after about 6 months, they get pretty tight in their production. And then after about 20 months, a cum number, Anadarko start to surpass what EOG was doing there. So again, there's strategy. Which one's better? Well, it depends on your strategy. EOG likes to get that initial production. There's a value of time and money in there that to worry about. And then there's, commodity price forecasting and all those things that go into it. So it's not to say one is better than the other. They're just different. But if you see that, you have no idea why that is until you go over to our other tool and you start to see, oh, well, if you compare the choke management, it is evident that Anadarko is employing a choke strategy of some kind, and it's a little bit variable, but still you can see their strategy versus an EOG, which is pretty wide open across the board. You can also look at pumps and see what time frame the pumps are put on, and realize that a lot of these things are being pumped from day one, and some of the other ones are let free flowing for months at a time before they actually throw a pump on them. So those kind of things and insights you can grab, because again, your first question is who's the best, and then the next question is, well, why? And so you get to do both of those items in our platform. And again, the data, part of the things that gets skimmed over sometimes is that using WellDatabase means that all of our tools are using the most up-to-date data. Every query you do is querying against a database that has the data updated from yesterday in it. And so if you create your decline curve analysis today in WellDatabase, it's based off of the data that was reported today. As opposed to if you export it out and take it into another package in another month or two, you're still looking at 2-month-old data. And so you got to go get new data and put it in. So there's an advantage to having that source that you're always referencing in our system. So yeah, those analytics, being able to do cross-plot all the different parameters and multivariate analysis there. And then, of course, the decline curves. We have some basic economic tools that allow you to come in and throw some numbers on the production so that you can get a dollar figure, kind of a back of an envelope look, but still really useful. And then we have some project management tools that allow you to dive in really around the data, managing the data side. So you can create projects of your wells and attach your files to those wells. And because larger companies have a lot of systems for that, but the smaller groups, they're largely managing their data files with email or Dropbox or something like that. And so our system allows them to manage some of that stuff and actually attach them to the wells that they belong to. So you can put your logs with your wells instead of just in a Dropbox folder that's seven folders down from your project that you can't find whenever you need it. You never can find it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's a lot of powerful tools there, and great points you raised. One of the things I was going to ask about was the economic side, because when you talk about who's got the best wells, like there's a ton of different ways people can take that. So from the sole production standpoint, that one's relatively obvious to figure out from data. As soon as as you want to look at the economics, that can greatly change the picture. And like you said, everybody kind of has different strategies and stuff too. So it's really cool that you can identify what those might be,
right?
And kind of learn into the minds of the leaderships of these companies.
Yeah, for sure. No, it is different. That's what people will look at a production chart and, call an IP better, and IP is not better necessarily, an IP actually is relatively meaningless in the grand scheme of things. But still it's not completely meaningless, but regardless, it's a piece of the puzzle. And even if by all accounts, your wells are not producing as much, and the minute all of a sudden you look at their operating cost and that, maybe their lateral links or whatever it may be, next thing you know, they're more economic than the others. And so it's, people want to put broad strokes on things a little too frequently. And that's got us into a little bit of trouble of an industry, if you ask me. But the nuances of the economics and what people actually get out of the wells are key. And so, so yeah, you can basically dive into every piece of that in WellDatabase using, as updated data as possible.
That's exciting. And then one thing I'll just throw out there too, and then I want to move on to some trends and like some big picture stuff to kind of wrap up here. But I do want to mention too that as you guys can actually, anybody listening can actually get even a free subscription to WellDatabase, right? You got some free tools as well as some paid features too. So this isn't just off limits to people who have a lot of money to spend on this, right? That's kind of what you guys are trying to achieve here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, I'm glad you brought that up because it is really key because we have a broader strategy with what we're doing. And so in February, we released our WellDatabase Lite program. And that gives you free access to well level data for every well in the country. And that's not just, headers or mapping. You get our mapping suite. You also get production data, you get completion data, you get all the pieces pulled together, and it's all free. And then when you get into analytics, you get into the other tools and data exports, and those are in our pay plans. And so we're not a charity yet, but still the idea is that we don't want people to have to go to state sites to get this data. It's cumbersome, it's painful, it takes too much time. And then, even if you're in a single state site, you have to jump between 5 different reports to find all the information you need in one place. Whereas WellDatabase, you click one button and it's all right there in front of you. And you can
do the
find
cleaning
exactly
and normalization and everything that you talked about to get it useful.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things we want to do. So, with our light plan, we want to build a lot of things around that data. We want to have conversations around data. We want to build a community around the data pieces, around the analysis and what's going into it, because people want to share, people want to talk, they want to understand better. And those conversations are kind of happening out in space right now. Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever they're happening, people are having real conversations about what's happening at a well level, at a field level, at a basin level, at an operator level. And we want to capture those and help center those conversations around data. And so that's largely what you'll see coming down the pipeline from us, amongst a lot of other really great tools that we're adding in. But a big thing is that we want to have a community built around the data platform that we have. And that's, where the free stuff comes into play. We give it to you free so that people can have a centerpiece to start talking. And then, we have other ways that we're going to build upon that audience and everything. But yeah, today, I don't really see a reason why any person would ever go to a state site when they can just come to WellDatabase for free and get the same data that they were getting there, or better, actually.
For sure. Yeah, and that's really cool that anybody can access that, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to mention it for sure in this podcast too. Is anybody listening, you guys can use this tool. I've even had a subscription for it, so and whatnot. But anyways, so it's a great tool out there that you guys can tap into and use. Kind of the ways I wanted to wrap up our discussion here was talking about some trends that you're seeing right now within this space, and pre-present COVID. I don't know how much this changes data, but and then kind of big picture issues that still need solved, and overall like the future. What exciting things, like or not even just so much like WellDatabase level, but just overall from this field. What your take on it is. What should we get excited for? What do you think the next thing is?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So. It's funny that so much of what we heard in the previous handful of years is about, moving to a digital oil field. It's been here for a while. I think it was a marketing thing and we just needed to pull these sources together. So I get some of that. What we're really talking about is an integrated oil field. And that's a piece that is still in its infancy. If you're not at a super major, there's a good chance that none of your tools are talking to each other. And so there's still that movement and that trend has been coming. It's had some setbacks with the COVIDs and things like that. And the downturn in, what was that, in 15, but these downturns have a way of kind of a dual effect. One, they completely shut down innovation for a period of time, because no one will spend any money, and that's understandable. But at the same time, they accelerate it because coming out of it, in this industry, we lay off people when times get tough. We're a very people heavy business. That's where the majority of our costs are. And so when it comes time to cut costs, it's cutting people. And when they come out of it, the question is always, do we need more people back, or do we replace it with technology? So yeah, there's a two-pronged attack to these things. In the beginning, it cuts innovation because everyone's budgets are basically roasted. And then as it starts to recover, you'll see innovation start skyrocketing for a period, and then it'll level off. And so from that standpoint, that's the current trend where we're sitting in the middle of right now. You know, it's how many, a number of startup founders that I know of that are in pretty bad pain right now. And it's very questionable whether they'll make it through this. That's part of it. But then, you know, data trends moving forward, you're going to see a bigger reliance on it. And that's been growing and that's going to continue to grow. And then moving forward, how we can integrate public sources with private sources, how we can get more real time, how we can get more granular data. Because at the end of the day, we still need large scale granular data to do any real technology moving forward, anything great at least. But, you know, between automation and integration, those pieces are really what needs to be moving forward. And on the public data side, you know, this industry has never been really cool with regulation very much, which in one hand, I understand, but on the other hand, it makes it very complicated for us to really scorecard ourselves on what's going on. And that starts with, you know, the permitting and production. And then it goes into our flaring and our methane emissions and those kind of things. And, you know, we're not doing ourselves any favor by kind of having that be so opaque. And so from the public data side, you know, what I would like to see is them start to become just a touch more granular. Most of the operators have the data available that they could report. We just need to kind of pull together and say, for the better of the entire industry, let's start to pull that data together. And I think that's an attitude that's starting to shift. When I first started in the industry, secrecy was key. You had secret sauce and you knew a bypass pay zone in a conventional field, and you didn't want anyone else to know until you could buy up all the acreage, right? So that was a very real thing, and it happened, and people are very successful doing it. It's not that way anymore. We're working in an unconventional world. We know what we have. There's still, you know, probably some discoveries to be had, but we would be, and this is kind of more of where I want to see things go. I think people are starting to open up more for sharing, and that's going to be key driver moving forward. If we can open up and kind of crowdsource some of this data at the more granular level for the better of the entire industry, rather than kind of pigeonholing it and calling it mine. And then WellDatabase wants to be a part of that. So our goal is to start facilitating the sharing of data. And our opinion is that in the past, you know, move past the secretive part and get into where we are today, people still don't want to share data because there's no reason for them to. There's no value. And so what we want to do is we want to create a medium where people can contribute data and gain immediate insights and value from it. And we think that'll prod people to start wanting to contribute data. And that's really what I'm excited about, because I think if we can build that platform where people can start to do that, we're going to start gaining insights that just aren't available right now. They're not there. Like you can't do a broad geomechanical basin study using proprietary data. You have to use a few, you know, target points, a few control points and vertical wells that were drilled in the 70s. And again, all this data is out there. We just need to pull it together. So, you know, data integration is really the next move for a lot of these service companies and operators. Get these things all talking to each other properly, play nice with each other for once in our lives. But then on that same note, you know, starting to share data, starting to find more granular data and getting that out in the public space so that we can all benefit from it. You know, this round, we might see some contraction with some operators. We might see some people, some of the bigger companies swallowing up these distressed companies, more bankruptcies and those kind of things. And that may facilitate it, or it may not. It's hard to say. But I do think that's what I'm excited about, is the ability to get larger scale data sets into the public space and let the data people out there, like a WellDatabase or other analytic firms, let them get a hold of it and then create some bigger insights for the better of the whole industry. And so I think that's coming. I really do. And I think it's going to be a really interesting thing.
Yeah, no, that definitely, I think, be the betterment of our industry. And like you said, there's definitely like still an element of secrecy. And we even see it on the OFO basic side, trying to partner with companies to talk about some stuff. And it's like, sometimes we go to these, especially contractors, right? A lot of them have material that they, you know, teach, you know, go to some of the EMPs and teach their engineers, or go to schools and teach it, right? So they have content, right? But they don't want to share it publicly because they think that their competitor will really take off if they get to see their 101 presentation on the same thing that they do. So like,
yeah,
you know, if their competitor needs a 101 presentation, then I wouldn't be too about them as competitors. But I mean, there's still just such a mentality in our industry about secrecy and all this confidentiality, and some of it rightfully so. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that should be shared, even for the betterment of our industry, looking and being better externally within our communities, and them having better insight to what actually goes on and being more transparent about that. And you see some kind of what you're talking about, people pulling their data together. We see some one-off kind of people, organizations trying to do it, like trying to track frac interferences and frac kits and that kind of stuff. Even some operators kind of got in on some of that, where they're sharing schedules with each other, obviously so they can protect their own assets and not slam each other all the time, and like just underground war, right? And I think, with what Frac Focus did in step 2, basically becoming like the standard, that even states require now people to report into. So I think that's a pretty exciting perspective you have, and hopefully hopefully that's the case.
Well, yeah, you made a good point. They're willing to share those schedules to protect their own assets, which is the bottom line. Look, people aren't going to just give away data for fun. They're not. Yeah. And that's okay. I can accept that. But if we can help facilitate getting value out of it, and so if you hand the data over, then all of a sudden you have instant access to your data and everybody else's data conglomerated into an engine that gives you insights. I mean, then what do you have to lose? All of a sudden you have something to gain. You can give that data in. You can pick and choose what you send in. It's not like you have to give everything, but at the same time,
right?
It's just that at the end of the day, you have to deliver some sort of value, or there's no motivation to do it. So I think that it has to be facilitated, but I do think that we're headed that way.
Awesome. Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure having you on. The thing I'll kind of wrap up with is kind of just high-level announcement here that we're going to be partnering with WellDatabase on some stuff coming up. So they're basically going to be the exclusive data provider for OVA Basics, and some of the stuff that we can use data for to further enrich our content and additional stuff that we produce in the coming months to years, and then also collaborate on some additional podcaster vlogs courses they do. Like they've got really good insight, as is obvious right through this episode, on what trends and stuff that operators are doing and whatnot, and just some of the analysis tools that John hit on. And so a lot of really cool content that we can work on together and produce some just a higher awareness on. And so we're really looking forward to a partnership, and so you guys will be hearing more about that I'm sure in the coming weeks or whatnot. So I'm pretty excited about that. And John, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing this space with it, getting us introduced to this world. I'm pretty excited. This is definitely a very interesting space.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Derek. No, and we're very excited about what you guys are doing is great, and I think that hopefully we can add a lot of value, and we can kind of again make a better system for everybody. So we're really excited to work with you guys. So thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Not a problem. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. And thanks everybody for listening. I hope you found this episode to be as valuable and insightful as I did. Be sure to check out WellDatabase, WellDatabase.com. They've got a lot of great tools, as you're well aware of now. So thanks again, John. And thanks everybody for listening. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy and stay safe. And we'll catch you on the next episode.